Good morning, boys and girls. I'm so glad to have a chance to spend some time with you this morning. As we have been talking about mothers in the Bible, we have a new mother that we're going to talk about today, and her name is Bathsheba. Let me show you how that's spelled. Bathsheba. Now, she had a son whose name was Solomon, and he was a very wise and mighty king. So let's back up a little bit and start at the very beginning. Solomon's father was King David, and his mother was Bathsheba. Now, if you remember David, he was the boy who killed the giant Goliath with a slingshot. When David became king, he was a righteous and good king, and he was chosen by God to be king. In this lesson today, we learn that David makes some very bad decisions and a very bad mistake. He broke several of God's commandments, including stealing and murder. He got caught in his sin, and then he tried to cover it up. Wow, that's a whole lot to think about, isn't it? So let's look in the Bible in 2 Samuel and see what happened. When David first became king, he went to war with his army against the enemies of Israel. So he actually went out into the battlefield with his army. But there came a time when the duties of his kingdom were so great that David had to let his general Joab lead the warriors while David stayed at the palace on Mount Zion to take care of things. Now one evening, just about dark, at sunset, David was walking on the roof of the palace, which that's a normal thing to do because the roof was usually a flat area where people could go and sit and look out over the land. He looked down into a garden nearby and he saw a woman, a very beautiful woman. David asked one of his servants, "Who is this woman?" And the servant told him, "Her name is Bathsheba. She is the wife of Uriah." Now, Uriah was an officer in David's army. He was under Joab, the general. And at the time, he was fighting in the war against the Ammonites, so he was away from home. David sent for Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, and he talked with her. David kissed Bathsheba, and he knew he loved her greatly and longed to take her as his wife. But David could not marry Bathsheba while she was still married to Uriah. This is when the wicked thought came to David's heart, and he formed an evil plan so that he could take Bathsheba into his own house as his wife. After a while, David realized he had done a very bad thing. He was ashamed of what he had done, and he cried out to God to forgive him. After God had forgiven David's great sin, David wrote Psalm 51, and that psalm was to remind him of his sin and how God forgave him when he asked him to forgive him. Now after this, God gave David and Bathsheba, who was now his wife, a son, and they named the son Solomon. Look how happy David is holding up his new baby boy. The Lord loved Solomon, and he grew to be a very wise man. Now, when David got older, Bathsheba encouraged David to name Solomon to be the next king. So when David got too old and too sick to rule the kingdom, he called for Solomon and named him the new king. After David died, Bathsheba helped Solomon. The young king wanted to lead well and to judge fairly and wisely, and God gave him that ability. He accepted his role as a servant of God. He obeyed God and depended on him to help him with the decisions he had to make as king. God not only gave Solomon wisdom, but he gave him great riches and honor and a long life. And Solomon remembered how much his mother had cared for him and taken care of him, and he cared for Bathsheba as she grew old. And this is just a picture of what Solomon might have looked like sitting on the throne, making some decisions with his wise councilmen. As we know, Jesus is from the house and lineage of David. So that means that he is a direct descendant of David, therefore Solomon. So he is a great-great-great-great-grandson of Solomon. Now, let's think about this. This is a pretty important story. Have you ever tried to hide something that you did that you knew was wrong, or just pretend that it never happened? Have you ever blamed someone else if something happened? Have you ever told a fib? This is a sin when you lie. It's called a lie when you fib. And then you've been caught and somebody said, no, that's not true. That's not what happened. Wouldn't it have been a whole lot easier to tell the truth in the first place? So there's two important things we have to remember here. We can't hide our sin from God. We might be able to hide it from people. You might be able to hide it from your parents, but we cannot hide our sin from God. God loved David too much to let him get away with being disobedient, which means that he did not follow God's commands. What happened if you told a fib and got caught? Did you get punished? Did you have time out? Did you have privileges taken away from you for a while from mom and dad so that they could help teach you that to tell a fib is wrong? Did you learn a lesson from that? And the second very big thing that we need to learn from David and Bathsheba is that God forgives us when we confess our sins, when we tell him what we've done and when we tell him we are sorry. When confronted by his sin, David said, yep, I did it. I own up to it. I have sinned against the Lord. And this is what he says. We see this in 2 Samuel 12:13. Now in Psalm 51, where I was telling about how David confessed his sin, his sadness over sin is just so overwhelming. He says, wash away all my iniquity, which is sin, and cleanse me from my sin. And that's in verse 2 of Psalm 51. In fact, Psalm 51 tells a very important part of this story that we don't want anyone to miss. I want you to hear this especially. David didn't just confess his sin. He believed that God would restore him, and he was right. The Bible calls David a man after God's own heart. So not only did David confess his sin and cry out to God to forgive him and ask him to restore him to the relationship that he had with God, but God did it. God heard him and God blessed him. He forgave him just like he forgives us of our sins. Now, David's sin was about as horrible a sin as you can think of. But no sin is too much for God to forgive. God knows the truth. We cannot hide from him. And we can't cover up the bad things we do, because that just leads to more trouble. So I am grateful that God forgave David and gave him and Bathsheba a wise son who ruled the kingdom fairly and justly. So you see, Bathsheba was a very important mother in the Bible. So we've got our mothers here that we've been talking about. Eve and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Deborah, Ruth, and now Bathsheba. I'm so glad to have had a chance to spend some time with you this morning. I love all of you and hope I'll see you soon. But until then, mwah.